Caleb Dawson rode into town with enough money to buy the finest horse at the annual livestock auction. But by sunset, he returned to the ranch leading an old mare, and holding the hand of a little boy no one wanted. What happened inside that auction yard would change an entire town forever. The annual livestock auction was one of the few days each year when nearly every rancher in the county gathered in the same place. Long before sunrise, wagons rolled into town, horses stamped impatiently outside the sale yard, and the streets filled with the familiar sounds of bargaining, laughter, and anticipation. For most of the men there, it was simply another business day. For Caleb Dawson, it was a necessity. Winter was approaching faster than anyone liked to admit, and his ranch desperately needed another workhorse if he hoped to bring in the last of the season's work before the first hard freeze settled across the valley. Few people noticed when Caleb rode into town that morning. He had always been the kind of man who never sought attention. Quiet. Honest. Dependable. The sort of cowboy who kept his word because he believed a man's character was measured long before anyone praised it. Years earlier, he had buried both his wife and the son they had dreamed of raising together. Since then, the ranch had become painfully quiet. The empty chair beside his supper table had remained untouched, and the silence inside his house had grown so familiar that he no longer noticed it. Around town, people respected Caleb, but they also understood there were wounds no conversation could reach. He carried his grief the same way he carried everything else, without complaint. That morning, Caleb walked slowly between the rows of horses gathered for auction. He studied each animal carefully, running experienced hands along sturdy shoulders, checking hooves, watching their movements with the practiced eye of a lifelong rancher. Mr. Briggs, the horse trader, greeted him with a broad smile. "Morning, Caleb. I've got 3 fine mares today that'll outwork anything on your ranch." Caleb tipped his hat politely and examined them one by one. They were strong enough. Healthy enough. But none of them felt quite right. He wasn't looking for the fastest horse. He was looking for one steady enough to carry the ranch through another winter. As he moved farther down the auction grounds, something unusual caught his attention. Across the dusty street, beyond the crowd gathered around the livestock pens, stood the county orphanage. A modest wooden building had decorated its porch with handmade banners for a charity event. Several children stood neatly dressed near the entrance, each hoping someone might stop long enough to ask their name. Some townspeople smiled as they passed. Others offered polite greetings before continuing toward the excitement of the auction. No one lingered. No one stayed. Then Caleb noticed one child who wasn't standing with the others. An 8-year-old boy sat quietly beside an old wooden fence, a small carved horse resting in his hands. He wasn't calling out. He wasn't waving at passing families. He simply watched the crowd with calm eyes that seemed far older than any child's should. It wasn't hope Caleb saw on the boy's face. Hope had disappeared long ago. What remained was acceptance. The auction bell rang, pulling Caleb's attention back to the horses. Business came first. Within an hour, he purchased an older mare that most buyers had overlooked. She wasn't beautiful, but she was dependable, gentle, and strong enough to work another decade. After settling the payment, he adjusted the lead rope and prepared to head home. As he passed the orphanage once more, quiet voices drifted through the open doorway. "I don't think anyone even asked about Noah today," the matron said softly. Pastor Thomas sighed. "People always want the younger children." "He's been here too long," she whispered. "Too old for most families. Too quiet for the rest." Caleb slowed his steps. "He doesn't cause trouble," the matron continued. "He just waits. Every event, every year. And every year someone else goes home." Pastor Thomas lowered his eyes. "Some children stop believing they're waiting for a family." Those words settled heavily inside Caleb's chest. For a long moment, he stood motionless beside his newly purchased horse. He could have climbed into his wagon. He could have ridden back to the ranch and forgotten everything he had heard. Instead, he turned around. The boy was still sitting beside the fence, gently tracing his thumb across the tiny wooden horse clutched in his hands. Caleb walked over and stopped in front of him. "You like horses?" he asked quietly. The boy looked up, surprised anyone had spoken to him. After a moment, he nodded. "My father carved this one," he answered, barely above a whisper. Caleb knelt until they were eye level. "What's your name?" "Noah." Another silence followed. It wasn't awkward. It was simply two lonely people recognizing something familiar in each other. Hours later, the townspeople could hardly believe what they were seeing. Caleb Dawson climbed into his wagon with the old mare tied behind it. Beside him sat Noah, holding his small travel bag and the carved wooden horse. The whispers began almost immediately. Did Caleb really take that boy? What's a man living alone thinking? He doesn't know what he's getting himself into. Others simply shook their heads, convinced grief had clouded the cowboy's judgment. Caleb ignored every word. He opened the wagon door, waited for Noah to climb inside, then settled onto the driver's seat. For several miles, neither of them spoke. The road stretched quietly toward the ranch as the afternoon sun settled lower across the prairie. Finally, Caleb glanced toward the nervous little boy sitting beside him. "You hungry?" Noah hesitated. "A little." Caleb smiled, a small smile, but the first genuine one he'd worn in years. "Good." He flicked the reins gently. "Let's go home." At that moment, Caleb believed he was simply giving one forgotten child a place to stay until life sorted itself out. He believed he was rescuing a lonely boy who had nowhere else to go. He had no idea that, before long, the child sitting quietly beside him would begin healing wounds Caleb himself had believed would never mend. That evening, after Noah had fallen asleep in the small guest room, Caleb quietly unpacked the boy's worn travel bag. Inside were only a few neatly folded clothes, the carved wooden horse, and a bundle of weathered papers tied together with faded string. Curious, Caleb untied the bundle. One by one, he unfolded the documents. Adoption papers. Every single one stamped with the same heartbreaking word. Returned. Life on Caleb Dawson's ranch changed so quietly that neither of them noticed it at first. The silence that had settled over the house for years slowly began giving way to the gentle sounds of another life. Every morning, a pair of small boots appeared neatly beside the front door. A second plate rested on the supper table. The rocking chair on the porch no longer sat empty every evening. The house hadn't become noisy. It had simply begun to feel lived in again. Noah remained as quiet as ever. Before the sun touched the prairie each morning, he was already awake. His bed was made with military precision, his room spotless, and every chore finished before Caleb even had the chance to ask. He swept the porch, carried water, stacked firewood, and fed the chickens without complaint. But Caleb soon realized the boy wasn't working because he enjoyed it. He was working because he believed one mistake might cost him another home. Every movement carried the same silent question, "Am I doing enough to stay?" Caleb knew that kind of fear. Instead of reminding Noah to work harder, he slowed him down. He taught him how to saddle a horse properly instead of rushing through the task. He showed him how to mend broken fences, explaining that strong things weren't built in a hurry. On quiet evenings, they stood together beneath the wide western sky as Caleb pointed toward the clouds. "See those?" he said. "High, thin clouds usually mean fair weather. But when they thicken and fall lower, it's time to bring the cattle home." Noah listened carefully, absorbing every lesson as though each one was another reason he might finally belong. The ranch hands watched from a distance at first, unsure what to make of the quiet little boy. But children have a way of softening even the hardest hearts. Before long, one carved him a wooden whistle. Another whittled a small toy wagon. No one admitted who made which gift. They simply appeared outside Noah's room, and each time he found one, the shy smile on his face grew a little easier to recognize. Then one afternoon, something happened that surprised everyone on the ranch. The old mare Caleb had purchased at the auction had refused every rider since the day she arrived. She tossed her head, backed away, and trusted no one. Even Caleb couldn't get close enough to calm her. The ranch hands had started calling her stubborn beyond saving. But Noah didn't approach her with ropes or commands. He simply walked toward her slowly, carrying the small carved wooden horse in his pocket. The mare lifted her head, watched him for a moment, then quietly stepped forward. She lowered her nose until it rested gently against the boy's shoulder. The ranch fell silent. Even Caleb couldn't explain what he was seeing. From that day forward, the old mare followed Noah wherever he went. He brushed her every evening, talked to her in whispers no one else could hear, and before long the two became inseparable. It was as though they recognized the same loneliness in one another. Yet something still lingered in the shadows. Every night, after supper, Noah carefully placed the little carved horse on the table beside his bed. He would sit quietly for a moment, looking at it with eyes far older than his years. Then, almost too softly to hear, he whispered the same words. "I'll find you someday." Caleb passed the room often enough to hear it, but he never interrupted. He never asked who Noah was speaking to. Some wounds revealed themselves only when they were ready. Meanwhile, the town continued talking. One afternoon, while repairing a fence, a ranch hand finally asked the question everyone else had been whispering. "Caleb, are you sure that boy belongs here?" Caleb drove another nail into the fence before looking up. "Sometimes home isn't where you're born," he said quietly. "It's where someone chooses you." The ranch hand nodded, though he wasn't sure he fully understood. A few days later, Pastor Thomas rode out to the ranch carrying a sealed envelope tucked inside his coat. He handed it to Caleb without a word. "There are things about Noah," the pastor said softly. "Things you deserve to know." Caleb looked down at the envelope, hesitating for a long moment before finally breaking the seal. Inside was a faded newspaper clipping, its edges worn with age. The headline described a terrible train accident years earlier. Dozens had died. Only one child survived. Beneath the article was a small photograph of a frightened little boy clutching a wooden horse. His name was Noah. Caleb sat alone on the porch long after Pastor Thomas had ridden away, the faded newspaper clipping resting in his weathered hands. The paper had yellowed with age, but the story printed across its pages remained painfully clear. Years earlier, during a violent autumn storm, a westbound passenger train had jumped its tracks while crossing a flooded bridge. Several railcars plunged into the river below, and by the time rescue crews arrived, there was little they could do. Entire families had vanished beneath the rushing water. Only one child had been found alive. The newspaper included a small photograph of a frightened little boy wrapped in a blanket, clutching a carved wooden horse so tightly that rescuers couldn't pry it from his hands. Beneath the picture were two simple words that stopped Caleb's heart: Noah Dawson. In that moment, everything Caleb had quietly wondered about the boy suddenly made sense. Noah hadn't been born quiet. He hadn't chosen loneliness. Grief had simply stolen the words from a child far too young to understand why the people he loved never came home. Caleb folded the newspaper carefully, not because it was fragile, but because the little boy sleeping inside his house deserved better than having the worst day of his life treated like an old headline. The next afternoon, Caleb rode back into town and stopped at the county orphanage. The matron welcomed him inside with a tired smile, already knowing why he had come. "You read the article," she said softly. Caleb nodded. She led him into her small office, where worn folders filled the shelves behind her desk. After a long silence, she opened one marked with Noah's name. "Several families tried," she said quietly. "At least they believed they did." She slid a stack of papers across the desk. "Some returned him after a few weeks. Caleb looked down at the familiar documents. One family wrote that he was too distant. Another. He doesn't smile enough. Another. He never talks unless spoken to. The matron's voice broke. They all thought something was wrong with him. She gently closed the folder. They never realized they were asking a little boy to stop mourning before he even understood his loss. Caleb lowered his eyes. No child should have to prove they're worthy of being loved. The matron smiled sadly. I've always believed that. As Caleb rode back toward the ranch, the afternoon sun stretched long shadows across the prairie. His thoughts never left Noah. For the first time, he wasn't thinking about how to raise the boy. He was thinking about how much pain one small heart had carried alone. That evening, after supper, the two of them sat quietly on the front porch watching the sky slowly fade from gold to deep blue. The old mare grazed peacefully nearby while crickets began singing across the fields. Neither of them rushed to fill the silence. Somehow, it already felt comfortable. Finally, Caleb spoke. I used to have a son. Noah turned slowly toward him. Caleb stared out across the prairie as though he could still see the life he had lost. He wasn't much older than you. A faint smile crossed his face. He loved horses. His voice softened. I thought I'd spend my whole life teaching him everything I knew. The smile disappeared. But sometimes life has other plans. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Noah quietly reached into his pocket and held the little carved horse in his hands. My father made this. His voice trembled. I don't remember everything about him. He looked down at the carving. I'm afraid, if I forget his face, I'll lose him forever. Caleb felt his throat tighten. Without thinking, he placed a gentle hand on the boy's shoulder. You won't. Noah looked at him, searching for certainty. How do you know? Caleb smiled sadly. Because the people we love don't only live in our memories. They live in the kind of people they helped us become. A tear slowly rolled down Noah's cheek. Barely above a whisper, he confessed the fear he had carried for years. I thought nobody wanted me. Caleb looked directly into his eyes. I don't think nobody wanted you. He paused. I think everyone before me simply failed to see you. Those words settled deep inside the little boy's heart. For the first time since arriving at the ranch, Noah allowed himself to believe he wasn't just staying there. He belonged there. The next morning, when one of the ranch hands asked where Noah was, Caleb simply smiled. He's home. And for the very first time, Noah quietly began thinking of the ranch that same way. But just as peace finally began settling over their lives, a polished carriage rolled slowly through the ranch gate. A well-dressed man and woman stepped down, accompanied by the county social worker. The woman smiled warmly as she looked toward Noah. We've come to adopt him. The arrival of the wealthy couple spread through the town faster than a prairie wildfire. Before noon, nearly everyone knew why the elegant carriage had stopped at Caleb Dawson's ranch. They were respected people from a neighboring city, unable to have children of their own, and they had come prepared to offer Noah a life few orphaned boys could ever imagine. A beautiful home. The finest schools. New clothes. Endless opportunities. To everyone watching, the choice seemed obvious. The townspeople quietly assumed Noah would leave. Even the ranch hands avoided looking Caleb in the eye, knowing how much the little boy had come to mean to him. But Caleb never tried to persuade Noah. Not once. When the social worker asked whether he wished to speak privately with the boy before any decision was made, Caleb simply shook his head. If Noah chooses to go, he said quietly, he deserves to leave knowing it was his choice, not mine. That evening, after everyone had gone, Noah slipped outside alone. The ranch rested peacefully beneath a sky filled with stars, and he wandered slowly through the property that had become his world. He ran his small hand across the weathered fence Caleb had taught him to repair. He paused beside the old mare, who nudged his shoulder gently before resting her head against him. He stood inside the quiet barn, breathing in the familiar scent of hay and leather. Finally, he climbed onto the front porch and sat in the old rocking chair where he and Caleb had shared so many quiet conversations. Every corner of the ranch held a memory. Every memory whispered the same thing. You are loved here. The following morning, Noah found Caleb feeding the horses. He walked over slowly, his hands tucked into his pockets, the little carved wooden horse still resting safely inside. Can I ask you something? Caleb smiled warmly. Always. Noah looked down at the ground. If I stay. His voice trembled. Will I still belong? Caleb set the feed bucket aside, knelt until they were eye level, and gently placed both hands on the boy's shoulders. Noah. His voice was steady. You belonged the day you walked through my front gate. The little boy's eyes filled with tears. Across town, people finally began to understand what had happened before their eyes. This was no longer a lonely rancher helping an orphan. This was no longer an act of kindness. It was a father and a son who had quietly found each other. Later that morning, Noah climbed into the wagon beside Caleb as they headed toward the county courthouse. The streets were unusually quiet. Neighbors stopped what they were doing to watch them pass. Some removed their hats. Others simply smiled. Every person there understood that the little boy riding toward the courthouse wasn't just making a legal decision. He was about to choose the place he would call home for the rest of his life. The county courthouse had witnessed countless land disputes, business contracts, and legal arguments over the years, but that morning, the old wooden room felt different. Every bench was filled with townspeople who had quietly gathered after hearing why Caleb Dawson and young Noah had come. The wealthy couple sat respectfully near the front, their expressions kind rather than resentful. Pastor Thomas bowed his head in silent prayer, while several ranch hands stood along the back wall, nervously twisting their hats in their hands. Even the judge seemed to understand that this was about far more than paperwork. It was about a little boy deciding where his heart truly belonged. The judge looked down at Noah with a gentle smile. You've been given a difficult choice, son. His voice was calm and reassuring. You may live with the family who has offered to adopt you. He paused before looking toward Caleb. Or you may stay with Mr. Dawson. The room became perfectly still. There is only one question I need you to answer. He leaned forward slightly. Where would you like to live? For several long seconds, Noah didn't move. He slowly reached into the pocket of his worn jacket and wrapped his fingers around the little carved wooden horse he had carried every single day since arriving at the ranch. The tiny figure had become smooth from years of being held, the edges softened by countless lonely nights when it had been the only piece of his father he had left. Noah walked quietly toward Caleb. Without saying a word, he opened Caleb's hand and carefully placed the little wooden horse into his palm. His voice trembled. My father made this for me. Caleb stared down at the carving, understanding the weight of what the little boy was doing. Noah looked up, his eyes glistening with tears. I think he'd want you to have it now. Caleb's composure finally broke. His eyes filled as he slowly knelt until they were face to face. He closed his fingers gently around the tiny wooden horse. I could never replace your father. His voice was barely more than a whisper. And I would never try. Noah smiled through tears that had waited years to fall. I don't need another father. He stepped closer. I just need you. A quiet gasp spread across the courtroom. Mrs. Ellis wiped her eyes with a handkerchief. One of the ranch hands turned away, pretending to admire the window so no one would notice the tears on his face. Even the wealthy couple smiled sadly, understanding that some bonds could never be purchased, no matter how much they had to offer. Caleb pulled Noah into a gentle embrace, holding him with the care of a man who had once believed he would never again have someone to call family. For the first time since standing beside two small graves years earlier, the fear that had kept Caleb's heart closed finally began to disappear. He realized that loving someone again didn't mean forgetting those he had lost. It simply meant allowing hope to live beside grief. The courtroom remained silent for another moment before the judge smiled warmly, removed his spectacles, and quietly reached for the adoption papers resting on his desk. Months slipped quietly into seasons, and little by little, the ranch no longer resembled the lonely place Caleb Dawson had called home for so many years. Every sunrise now began with the sound of Noah laughing as he raced across the pasture on the old mare that had trusted him from the very beginning. The ranch hands took turns teaching him everything they knew, from roping calves to repairing fences, each lesson carrying the quiet pride of men who had come to love the boy as one of their own. Pastor Thomas visited often, never arriving empty-handed, while children from town found endless excuses to spend their weekends at the ranch. The house that had once echoed with nothing but silence now overflowed with muddy boots by the door, cheerful voices around the supper table, and the kind of laughter that makes a place feel like home. One crisp autumn afternoon, Caleb returned from town leading the magnificent horse he had originally hoped to buy months before. Noah's face lit up as he ran across the yard. "So?" He laughed, gently patting the horse's neck. "You finally bought your horse." Caleb smiled, resting one hand on the saddle before looking at the young boy standing beside him. "No," he said softly. "I bought that horse months ago." He placed a warm hand on Noah's shoulder, his eyes filled with quiet gratitude. "What I really brought home was my son." Without hesitation, Noah threw his arms around Caleb, holding him tightly as though he never intended to let go again. Along the fence line, neighbors and ranch hands who had gathered to welcome them home watched in respectful silence. Some smiled proudly. Others quietly wiped tears from their eyes. They remembered the whispers that had filled the town the day Caleb left the auction with a little orphan instead of simply another horse. Now, standing before them, was all the proof anyone would ever need that compassion could change not only one life, but many. Sometimes we spend our lives chasing the very thing we believe will solve our problems. Caleb rode into town searching for a stronger horse to help carry the weight of his ranch. Instead, he came home with a little boy who carried the weight of his heart. Because the strongest families are not always the ones we're born into. Sometimes, they're the ones love quietly chooses for us.